That's not the right.
That's not the right slide.
There
Yeah, there we go.
There we go. But now you also need to start the webinar itself.
Yep.
Which is just pressing the big blue button at the top.
Okay, should be all good.
Brilliant. So welcome everyone. We've got a huge number of attendees today. We're very excited about today's event, and apparently so are all of you. So we will just give it a few minutes so that everyone can come in, because Zoom does not allow everyone to arrive at once. For those of you who are flooding in as I speak, welcome. Welcome to all of you. I hope you're having a lovely morning, afternoon, evening and night, depending which part of the world you're coming in from today. And you will notice your cameras and your microphones are off. However, you will have a chance to put Q&A, ask questions of our speakers shortly. The event will be starting in a few minutes as soon as everyone comes in. Unfortunately, Zoom takes a little while to trickle large numbers in, so we will start in a few minutes. In the meantime, if you have time and you're feeling friendly, please do take the time to say hello in the chat. The chat function at the bottom of the Zoom. We do like to see how many people are coming. We like to see who you are, where you're from, particularly how many countries. We love to see how many countries we managed to pull in for a lecture, particularly today's transatlantic extravaganza. So please, if you have the time, take the time to say hello in the chat and introduce yourself to our speakers and to all of each other. If you have any questions, also do add them in the chat. For technical issues, we will be starting in a few minutes once everyone has come in. We're up to 60 already. A few more people will probably come in soon, so we'll just start in a few seconds. But in the meantime, welcome and good morning, good evening, good we are, well, depending where you are. For me, it's nighttime. I'm in Dubai, as you know, so it's coming on up to bedtime for me. But I know in America, for some of you, it's actually really quite early in the morning. So thank you for taking the time to come and join us. All right, the numbers seem to have slowed down, so I think we're pretty much ready to get started. So first of all, welcome to today's talk. Oh, Mark, the chat's disabled. You need to just allow that you're the host now, so you're the one who has to do that. Sorry, general housekeeping. I was about to move into the housekeeping, but we can do that there. If you can't do it here, you can do it around the back on the Zoom thing itself, but just let me know. In the interim, welcome everyone. We're really happy to see you all here, and we hope you are as excited as we are for this event. I will enable the chat in a second, just as soon as I stop talking, so bear with us. Brilliant. Chat is now enabled. That is good. We're very happy about that. So once again, hiccups aside, welcome everyone to today, lunchtime's talk with Bernard Beatty and Jerome McGann on Reading Byron Now. We are so excited to be having this event. We, the Byron Society of the UK, and I know we, the Byron Society of America, we are genuinely thrilled to be able to bring these two speakers together and also to be able to collaborate on this event. Just a few housekeeping rules for those of you who've attended our online events before. You'll know all this information already, but in case you don't, if Mark, you could skip to the next slide, please. So, digital housekeeping. There are two ways you can send us messages. The first one, the chat function, which is the single speech bubble. Please put any comments you want to make to each other, where you're coming from, who you are. Those go in the single speech bubble chat. Also, if you have any technical difficulties for whatever reason, those will also go in the single speech bubble chat. However, this is a moderated discussion. We want to encourage audience participation, even though your cameras and your microphones are off. So if you have any questions throughout the event, please do drop them in the Q&A. That is the double speech bubble chat. So remember, double speech bubbles is for questions for the speakers. Single speech bubbles is just to say hello and just say hello, really. So our moderator will be using your questions, pulling out strategic questions from your Q&A to ask our speakers and keep the conversation, active and engaged, and make sure that your own personal questions are being included. So although we won't have a formal Q&A at the end of this session today, we will have questions throughout. So please, anytime you think of anything, do put it in the double Q&A box. Also, just for those of you who might be asking, or if for whatever reason you can't join the full event or the connection goes, we are, because this is a momentous occasion for Byronists everywhere, we are actually recording this event and we'll be working out how to distribute it afterwards. This is new for us, so we don't quite know what we're doing on that side, but there will be a recording and it will be made available afterwards. So, moving back to the talk itself. Mark, do we have another slide? Are we staying on digital housekeeping for this one? So, once again, welcome to all of you. I've seen even more participants have joined. So once again, welcome to all the delegates. Thank you for joining us today. If you have any questions for our speakers, do put them in the Q&A as you were just flooding in. And otherwise, kick back and enjoy the event. So it is my really great pleasure to be able to welcome two leading lights in the Byron world to our talk today. Bernard has been a staunch supporter of Byron studies since his first thesis on Lord Byron back in the 1960s, and he has lectured on Byron and other less important writers at Liverpool University from 1964 through to 2005, and he is still a fellow at Liverpool University, and he's produced a number of award-winning books, as well as serving as editor of the Byron from 1988 even, to 2005. And he's been hugely supportive of Byron scholars and is always ready to give advice and kind words. And today he will be discussing his new book, Reading Byron. Nice little product pitch here. Which was published. Meanwhile, Jerome McGann has been profoundly influential in Byron studies for many years. He literally wrote the books plural, or rather edited the multi-volume collection which we all use on a daily basis, namely the Complete Poetical Works, as well as a number of other books and essays on Byron and his peers. And he is currently Professor Emeritus in the Department of English at the University of Virginia. And today he will be discussing a new book, Byron and the Poetics of Adversity, which was published earlier this year with Cambridge University Press. And I really think it's rare to have two such magnificent books by outstanding scholars coming out at the same time, which directly speak to each other, even as they give us, their readers, new ways of reading Byron. And I think I speak for everyone today, all 77 attendees, which is a record for us for an online event, when I say how excited I am about the discussion that's coming up. In addition, if that wasn't enough, we are lucky to have Professor, who is president of the American Byron Society, amongst various other achievements, to transatlantic discussion between two titans of Byronism. So Andy, Bernard, Jerry, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you, Emily. Thanks very much. And thanks to Bernard and Jerry for being here. When we saw these two books coming out, the Byron community was very excited, and we decided what would be better than to have them talk to each other. I know a bit about the genesis of both books and the way that they came into being in conversation with one another from the outset, but we want to hear more about that. Nothing so difficult as the beginning. We talked about this a bit before we started. How do we get this conversation launched? And I basically want to get out of the way and have these two talk to one another. But we thought we might start by looking at the covers of the books. Why not? What's going on with the pictures on the covers, and maybe have each of you talk a little bit about how the exterior of the book relates to the interior and how it relates to your view of Byron. So I don't know, Jerry, do you want to pick up the ball on that one? And
sure, I will. I was a long fan of Delacroix, and particularly of that picture. And although I had no intention, I have to speak to an issue that involves Bernard and myself personally in a very close way. I had no intention of writing Byron and the Poetics of Adversity until Bernard and I got into a conversation about some crux issues in the plays, particularly Lara and Conrad in the Corsair. And so this book just sort of came as a consequence of that. The picture is important to me because it captures my sense of the importance, not just of conflict in Byron and contradiction and fighting this extremely male world that he inhabits and populates, but the struggle that's at the heart of it. And even more than that, the importance as a consequence of that, of the early things. We think of Don Juan as the great masterpiece, and it certainly is. But I have to confess for myself that the dark poems of Byron have always been the ones that have most captured me. And I would say that for the first 100 years of Byron's life in the world, it was the poems that run from Childe Harold to Manfred and say Childe Harold 4, the whole of Childe Harold certainly, the dark poems so-called, that captured the imagination of Europe. And for that matter of America. And it was really only in the 20th century that Don Juan began to emerge as the masterpiece that it is. And so the Poetics of Adversity is very definitely an effort to ask us to read Byron in the context of 1809 to 1817 and 1818, then from, say, 1818 to his death in 1824. And to see that period, the 1818 to 1824, in relation to 1809 to 1817, 1818, I should say.
So that's and Jacob wrestling with the angel, that connects a little bit to the, I mean, adversity, obviously, but we might bring it up too in connection to the religious thematics of Bernard's book. We may want to get into that too. I mean, but do you want to, why don't you ask Bernard about his cover? Because you were asking him earlier, Jerry.
I'm dying to ask Bernard about his.
Yes. Yeah, go for it.
Well, we're cheating really because we asked this question just before we began, but we haven't really rehearsed it. So let's pretend we haven't. Why did we have the cover? Well, as soon as I conceived a book called Reading Byron, I didn't want a picture of Byron on the front. I wanted a picture of someone reading Byron, because that's what the book is about. And instantly I thought that I wanted, if possible, a rather beautiful woman. So of course I thought of Emily Patterson Morgan, who's the director, who's governing this discussion. And I did actually mention it to him. But in the course of actually the book being produced, David Woodhouse, who edits the book, and he did far more for it than most editors do, discovered this absolutely marvelous picture. I can't remember the name of the artist. It's about 1928. The woman is a model he uses in several of his pictures. So presumably the relation with the book comes from the painter rather than the woman holding it. I just wanted that. Partly I wanted it to be surprising, and partly picking up what Jerry's just said. The book, like Jerry's concern, my concern, yes, I just agree with Jerry. It's mainly in a way with the dark poems, which is why I first encountered and got hooked on Byron. Don Juan is his greatest poem. We don't have to sort of argy-bargy between the two things. But I was hooked on that, and I still remained hooked on that. So being a slippery English person, I mean, Jerry is a direct and honest person. So he has a direct and honest picture which represents the book. But me being slippery, of course, represent a book about dark Byron by putting the brightest possible picture that I can find. But in another way, to come back from that, actually, those two pictures covers together, accidentally as it is, are pretty good, aren't they? Jerry said a moment ago that Byron lived in a very male world, and that's true. And he's interior to a male world, a world of adversity. Yeah, that's entirely right. But Byron, far more than most English poets, you'd have to go to Chaucer or Shakespeare, actually inhabits the world of women. So it's really nice that those two images come together in a single act of, if you like, reading Byron. Yeah.
Yes. It's the sweetness of the picture that is so striking. When I think of, I mean, Byron is definitely a person who is carried forward by women readers in the 19th century. There's no doubt about that. And some of his greatest readers, I would say the greatest is probably Emily Bronte, are deep readers of Byron and profound readers of Byron. So having a woman on that cover is right. It's the sweetness of the woman that's so striking. Yeah. Because the women I think of, like Ellie Ale and Emily Bronte and so forth, are people who are Byronic in their own right, it seems to me, in the dark sense.
Well, maybe we can stick with the theme of reading a little bit, since the title of our session and of Bernard's book, and the role language plays in both books. It seems like both of you are very attentive to, what have we not paid attention to enough in Byron's work? How does his use of language, how has that escaped our critical apprehension up until this point? And what intervention you both wanted to make in terms of Byron's use of language, tying his being remembered in his line to his land's language, that quotation from Childe Harold. Maybe you both could talk a bit about that, about the intervention that your book is making about Byron's attitude and use of language.
Bernard, why don't you start?
Yeah, sorry, I mean, I'll pick up. I won't talk too long because you come in, Jerry, but I'll in a way quote you, because one of the things you make a fuss of in your book, and you do it very well, is to distinguish Byron's relationship to language from that of Wordsworth and Eliot. Wordsworth wants, a special sort of language, theoretically the language of all men, though actually doesn't really produce the language of all men. Nevertheless, he doesn't want the language which is simply available to him, given to him, the language which is knocking about. No, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to choose my language. And Eliot, in a different way, talks about purifying the language of the tribe and so forth. So you're choosing a special language, or you're seeking to refine and purify, in some sense, control language. Byron is the exact opposite of that. This is me talking, but it's Jerry's point. Byron, if you like, wants to receive language. It's a gift. It's a given. He uses the vocabulary, a workman doesn't despise his tools, and it's a tool. It's there. Now, that attitude to language is not one in terms of relation to poetry, in terms of criticism in the 20th century, for example, that was normative at all. No. We want this rather peculiar, special attitude to poetry, associated in the first instance with new criticism, and then there's various theoretical disciplines. We want it divorced from, so to speak, the flood, the language which we stand in the middle of. Byron always stands in the middle of language. We didn't have, literary critics in particular don't really like that vocabulary. I'm shut up now, but I have been saying your points, I think, Jerry.
Well, I mean, obviously, there's so many things that Bernard and I have share in our way of thinking about and responding to Byron, but this matter of language, we're almost 100% in agreement. Byron's approach to language, as I'm really footnoting what Bernard just said, he doesn't see a problem with language. In fact, language to him is almost salvific in itself. It's a kind of grace that you get. The thing about Wordsworth and say Eliot, those are the two people that most came to my mind, is that they see language as a problem, as something that needs to be helped or cured or in some way fixed, because it's a difficulty. But Byron doesn't have any problem with language. At any point in the language, it can be as obscene as possible. It can be as high-minded as possible. The whole range of it is what he finds a graceful gift to him, and he enters into it. And it's impossible not to, especially in Don Juan, of course, to respond to it. The problem with the early work is that he's using language as a weapon to engage and provoke a readership that he does not trust. And at least that's my sense of him in the so-called dark years. It's a insidious and dangerous language that he begins to deploy in English bards and Scotch reviewers, and he carries that on all the way through. It doesn't become less so until Manfred, that really great comic poem, the first of the comic poems that is written really almost at the same time when he finishes that he begins Beppo. It's not many people think of the relation of those two, but Manfred is a very, very comic poem, full of the kind of differences of tone that Goethe tried to introduce into Faust. So
is that another kind of insidiousness? That, like, to what extent? But say more about that, about the insidious quality of the earlier work that Manfred gets beyond, or is Manfred just another turn of that style?
To me, the pivot point of Manfred is the place where Manfred's angst is driven off is when he's in that hysterical state where he's trying to get Astarte to forgive him for his sin, or for whatever sin that he has committed upon her. And he says one word for mercy. And what Astarte says is Manfred. And it's a stunning answer. Because if anything, the most thing that he needs is actually mercy, and he is unmerciful to himself. And it's a gift that she gives him that he would never have expected to get. And at that point, he's actually released, and everybody knows what happens after the rest of that poem.
Bernard, what's your sense of Manfred as at where it falls in Byron's trajectory? We often look at it as a kind of hint.
I'll pick up from Jerry. Jerry and I, Jerry said a moment ago that we agree, and we do agree on thousands and thousands of things. We agree deeply, not superficially. But about Manfred, I take it rather differently. So I'll begin with not with the difference, but where I agree, because I think Manfred is, so to speak, the generation, the pregnancy, and the giving birth to a comic term. But I wouldn't call it a comic poem. It seems to me, so to speak, an anti-comic poem that unleashes the possibility of, I'm almost pleased with the formulation. It's an anti-comic poem that unleashes the possibility of comedy, which I tend to associate with the last line. And I'm quite happy to associate that back, because I've not really thought enough about it. The relation with, I mean, I have thought about it, of course, the relation with the Phantom of Astarte. Is that enough, or should I say some more?
I think that's really useful. Doesn't Byron, when he finishes Manfred, he says something like, "I'm a devil of a mannerist, and I must leave off." He realizes the Manfred is. He writes to Murray. He says something. You know, I think he himself saw it as a kind of transitional work, and Beppo, as you say, comes right after it, and so it seems like it's an important one for testing what he was doing.
Well, what's important there, and Jerry made the point, and he made it rather differently than me, but it's the same point. And he said that very few people associate Manfred and Beppo. Well, Jerry, I do kind of think you're entirely right. There is a manifest link between those two poems. But to actually articulate how that works seems to me to be extremely difficult. I mean,
let me try something there. The devil of a mannerist remark, Andy, is really quite pertinent, because what he's talking about is the Gothic turn and tone and mode that he's been pursuing from 1812 forward into the time of Manfred. So Manfred is clearly in the Gothic mode, and he's a little concerned about whether he's still there, and he wants to get rid of that. And then comes Beppo. But what is Beppo? Beppo is a Byronic Oriental tale turned inside out. It's exactly the model of a Gothic tale, and any of the poems that written between 1812 and 1815 in that mode would have ended in disaster. What Beppo ends in is a tea party between the two men and Laura, and it's completely charming, although in the background is a lot of danger, but it has turned away from that.
And there's the distinction there, Italy. I mean, as we talked about Byron and language, and it's something about his immersion in the Italian language. This is great kind of praise of the Italian language. I love the liquid language. Is it that move to Italy that somehow changes his imaginative away from, say, Ottoman Greece into Venice and into the Italian literary tradition that prompts that change? We're talking about his relationship to language. To what extent is Brian's multilingualism part of that experiment?
I think it's possible that his desire to inhabit Italian, which he has, being in Italy, so to speak, and through women in a way, the desire to inhabit Italian. So he actually thinks at some stage that he might actually write poems in Italian. And that's part of his desire to, so to speak, do that to England kind of thing, to say, look, I'm not part of England. Look, I'm making my way now in this different, wider European world. Paradoxically, and it's always a paradox with Byron, I suspect that it's the deliberate intention to immerse himself in Italian, which actually allows him a range of English the Ottava Rima English, which he wouldn't otherwise have had, and enables him to recognize that, so to speak, his home is in the English language. He needs that other thing to make that recognition.
There's in my book, I quote a letter that's rarely quoted in relation to Byron in Italy, and it's Shelley's letter when after he's read Childe Harold 4, and he's observed Byron's notorious life in Venice and Italy. And he writes that incredible letter where he basically talks about it as if he were some kind of raving Puritan, denouncing Byron's misbehavior and disgraceful behavior in Italy. There is a sense, it seems to me, that what Italy showed Byron, gave Byron, was a kind of shamelessness that exposed the hypocrisy of the place of England. And I'm sure he felt that England was a place, he called it cant, but it is a place where, from his point of view, there was just rampant hypocrisy about fundamental things, not least of all sex, in every aspect of sex.
That makes sense. Well, I want to keep you two talking, and I asked Jerry to come with some questions for Bernard about his book and maybe vice versa. So I don't want to preempt that. So Jerry, do you have a question for Jerry about, Jerry, do you have a question for Bernard about his book that you'd like to talk further
Absolutely.
about?
I want, Bernard, I do want you to talk about something. You know that this is what was right at the beginning of the conversation that we began several years ago. It was a remark that you made that Byron's work is addressed to the understanding. I find that a deeply profound and true remark, and I would like you to comment even further on it.
Thanks very much. I mean, I don't collect compliments, but that's one I'd like to collect. Yes. I mean, I suppose in the first instance, and the less interesting instance, it's adversarial. That's to say, when I first encountered Byron and the world around Byron, which meant the world of critical books and general reception, how he was taught and so forth, which was not too dissimilar from the world in which you moved. The idea that Byron fundamentally had anything to do with the understanding was ridiculous, pooh-poohed. No. He's this absurd rhetorical poet of the 19th century. He hasn't got anything to communicate. On the other hand, he is this, pretty good, lightweight satirist. I mean, that was all, drove me mad. I didn't drive me mad. I drove it mad because it wasn't true. Because when I read Byron, I'm puzzled. I'm led into things which otherwise I wouldn't be led into. I'm forced to think in ways that I wouldn't normally think. I'm forced to hold together things that I don't normally hold together, and hold them together for longer than I could possibly imagine. I'm forced also to get through that to some sort of point of synthesis, but also sometimes not to be able to do that. It doesn't work, and you simply have to accept that you can't get any further. Now, just describing that process seems to me to describing what it's like to encounter someone who understands things that I don't, and I'm learning from him. And I mean, I'm not a missionary, but if I'm in a world surrounded by people who don't think like that, I want to shout it out to the skies, basically. So that's more or less it.
Yeah. This idea that Byron is brainless, as well as a bad writer, probably the central text is Matthew Arnold's, where he basically mistranslates Goethe in saying that when he thinks he is a child, he really has no mind. Your outrage at this way of thinking about Byron, mine is located there in spades. The reason that this, I think, idea persists is that when people think about intellectual power and importance, they think about it in terms of systematic philosophy, which is exactly the wrong way to think about both, in my opinion, thinking, and certainly the wrong way to think about Byron's thinking. Byron is a profound and provocative thinker, and he's not a systematic thinker. In fact, his view, as we all know, was that if you start to sink into systematic thinking, you're going to, well, his word was, your case is hopeless. And it's that difference between the way we think about, say, I want to say, is Montaigne a thinker? Is he a philosopher? To me, he's one of the most profound philosophers, as is, say, Cicero. But these are philosophers who approach thought and understanding and those issues in an entirely different way from St. Thomas Aquinas or Hegel or Heidegger or systematic thinkers of that kind.
But you know, it's sort of in tension with that anti-systematic, or maybe one of the reasons the charge keeps getting leveled at Byron is because he thinks through cliche so often in actually very productive and experimental and avant-garde ways. But Byron is no enemy to cliche, and that has wrong-footed various people who think, oh, that just means he has no new ideas. I think partly I'm echoing some of the things you've said, Jerry, about the way he works through everyday language, idiom, cliche, towards other reaches.
I'll just briefly say, it was a late realization on my part that Don Juan, this masterpiece, is basically a masterpiece of built on cliches and sort of anecdotes, all sorts of vox populi language. And it's astonishing that you should have been able to make such music out of such what appear to be trivial aspects of the English language.
Yeah, I agree with all that, needless to say, but I would interject the opposite, which isn't actually undermining it. And I would interject with reference to a book that both Jerry and I think were strongly influenced by and grateful for, Paul West, Byron and the Spoiler's Art, which we read at the time when there was a desert of books about Byron. And here was a highly intelligent bloke actually reading Byron and thinking there's something there to actually try to follow. Now, one of his chapters, and I was very struck by when I first saw the title, was The Escape from Cliche. And the whole chapter was about that. It was absolutely, to me, it was like gold. Now, yes, Byron uses cliches, but at the same time, he's also seeking to escape from them, either by outreaching them or by putting you in a situation of consciousness where you, so to speak, recognize the cliche. No, I'm not putting it very well. It's stronger and more difficult than that. Outwitting the cliches, that's what it is, because a cliche is always current. A commonplace is repeated over time. So there's that sort of difference. And sometimes you can't tell the difference between a cliche and a commonplace, and cliches can become commonplaces. That's a kind of tricky situation. And Byron, I think in Don Juan in particular, one might say navigates between cliches and commonplaces. The language which is around him and which you can't possibly escape. You have to use it. You're inside it. You can't get out of it. And yet at the same time, and it might be just a complete waste of time, a glancing off, something that later would be ridiculed. On the other hand, it might say something, the cliche of that time might say something about that time, which couldn't be got at in any other way. And it might be, it might be an embryonic commonplace. Now, it seems to me that I've broadened the discussion a little bit away from simply the escape from cliche. That's all I was trying to do. I don't think I did it very well.
Bernard, that is so interesting. As soon as you make the distinction between commonplace and cliche, you begin to clarify the situation. Generally in, say, Don Juan, but I think it's true across all the poetry, if you get what one might call a cliche or a phrase that has a cliche character, you're immediately in the area of satire or possible satire. But if you're using commonplaces, no. The satire is not really the main issue in that case. But in each case, when you're using these forms that are so in common usage, let's say, or in common awareness, what you're getting at is the edge that he will be able to play with these two different common linguistic forms.
Yes, I agree entirely with that. Yes, yes. Well, we've got somewhere that we couldn't have got to other than without this little bit of conversation. That's nice, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, I love the idea of outwitting cliche. That's going to stick with me. I think that's a great phrase of yours, Bernard. And well, maybe this segues naturally into a conversation about form. We've talked about language and cliche and maybe ideas and things like that. That's another charge that we touched on, though, that has been laid at Byron's feet, is the versification or just genre form. What do you have to say to I know your books both touch on questions of form. Do you want to engage that? What Byron did with questions of form, either at the local prosodic level or larger questions of genre?
I talk too much. Let Jerry say something.
Well, I mean, I wrote, Don Juan in Context, in which I tried to address the issue of form. There's this sense in which Byron is as formal a poet as Dryden or Pope, and he understands the how to construct useful forms, for sure, at the most local level of the couplet or something like that, and also in larger frames of reference. But his awareness of form is what allows him, it seems to me, to break form in those astonishing ways that he does in the earlier poems, but never anything like what begins to happen in Manfred and Beppo and Don Juan. But I don't think you could have done that unless you understood how form allowed you to break free of the constraints of form.
Yeah, you see it in Childe Harold as he starts blowing through the ends of the stanzas. The Spenserian really starts to become a different kind of putty in his hands as he learns how to use it through practice. 1 and 2 are very different beasts than 3 and 4.
Those passages, Andy, just take my breath away. When he takes that famous stanza and he utterly transforms it and yet keeping the stanza. Those moves would not have been able to be made if he didn't understand the rules, as it were, of the stanza.
Yeah.
Yes.
Needless to say, I entirely agree with that. You inhabit the form in order, and you don't, not in order, but that enables you to, so to speak, go beyond the form, in a certain sense, disrupt, overturn, and all the rest of it. Yes. The other thing, you used a phrase, and I can't quite remember what it was, but you talked about Byron's interest in usable forms, I think, or something like that. And I think that's entirely right. I don't think Byron's given enough credit for experimenting with form. He's always trying to do new things and seeing what will work. I mean, if you just think, for example, of Heaven and Earth, or the choruses in that, or a whole series of metrical surprises that he does, even the whole adventure. Okay, Whistlecraft's done it years ago. Fairfax's Tasso used the Salvarima, but nothing really had existed like Beppo in the English language. A perfectly formed Chaucerian tale in a verse form which had never been fully acclimatized, and Byron inhabits the bloody thing and makes it work. That's a kind of experiment, but it's an experiment which is trying to find what can work, what can I do? There's an openness in Byron's relationship to form, which I entirely agree with the way you put it, derives from the fact that he's buried himself in form. He respects form in the first instance. Yeah.
You mentioned Paul West's book. It is a book that I have admired ever since I read it, and I still do. There's one other Byron scholar that has had perhaps an even greater influence on the way I think about it, and it's G. Wilson Knight.
Of course.
And in particular, Poets of Action. And I raise that because I'm thinking of Auden's notorious comment about poetry making nothing happen. If Auden, who's everybody knows, a descendant of Byron, had said that to Byron, Byron would have been very upset, and he certainly would have disagreed with him, because he certainly wanted his poems to make something happen. And I think that's at the heart of the idea of a poetry of action. And since you asked me to ask Bernard some things, I would like you to comment on that. Byron as a poet of action.
You make a lot of it in your book, and I like it. And of course, it instantly reminded me the phrase "poet of action" is the phrase Wilson Knight himself used about Byron. And needless to say, I share your admiration. Wilson Knight was incredibly important to me because he was like, he was like a voice in the wilderness, open to all kinds of fruitful, deep byways, so to speak, and not byways, straightways in Byron, which no one else seemed to be. And he was brave, he was courageous. He wrote out of what he discovered. So he was tremendous to me. Now, action. You talk well about it. Action is linked, and here's the danger of the word, and you yourself make the connection, of course, to performance. But performance sounds like a tricky word. It's what actors do. It's some of the, it's just a performance. Action, on the other hand, is the domain of heroes. And that's a good thing, although we're now anti-heroes, but nevertheless, traditionally, it's a good thing. But Byron, so to speak, Byron's performances are always forms of action. And his performances are indeed theatrical. That's what leads to people to patronize him and all the rest of it. But it's again a theater of action. Even those things which are sometimes mocked, when he went to Greece and he took his he took his crimson uniform and he took his big hat and all the rest of it. I mean, that's a performance, but it was a serious performance, because Byron wasn't just simply a performer in Greece. He actually, for the first time and the best time in his life in that way, he actually worried about details. He conciliated disputes. He thought of all kinds of practical things in terms of warfare. And yet the other side of that is the establishment, the quasi-symbolic establishment, as it were, of the man in charge, the performing man, the strange man, the man from abroad, the aristocrat. It doesn't matter what. For many of us, there is a gap between performance and action, and it's a question of inauthenticity. That simply doesn't arise in Byron, not arise at all.
I also think, Bernard, that if a poem actually doesn't enter the world in that way, it hasn't actually tested itself fully. And it seems to me like we speak of Byron born for contradiction. He speaks of himself about it. We say he's the poet of contradiction. But what you really need are the contradictions of Goethe, or the contradictions even more of Wordsworth and Eliot and Byron's enemies. And one of the astonishing things about Don Juan is that his enemies are in there, and they're allowed to have their way. The place in the poem that is most clear where that is the case is when he sends the first two cantos, and his friends in London are all worried about this passage and that passage, and they want him to change it, and they want him to correct it, revise it, and even expurgate it, and he won't have any of it. So the thing is put into proof, everything is fine. In the last minute, Murray and his friends say, no, this stanza absolutely can't go in. And this passage can't go in either. And so enter the asterisks. And Byron is just absolutely outraged. That's, but that is for me the primal instance of Byron being born for contradiction. The reading that is in those asterisks tells you that that poem is in the world, and it's causing a problem.
Not only that, it's the way he gets, again, following on what you've said, it's the way he includes his enemies. It's the way he uses adversity to undo itself. He gets adversity on his side, so to speak. He undoes it. I mean, that's, it's not unlike Pope in the Dunciad, which must have been a sort of implicit model for him.
Yes.
We have some questions coming in from the audience, and one that I'd like to hear you both say a little bit about. Where this is the title of our session is Reading Byron Now, but it sort of implies a reading Byron then. And if you could say just a bit on how your understanding of Byron has changed over time, and not a full autobiography, but if you think of the Byron that you started with and the Byron that you admire now, tell us a little bit about that delta, that change. I think it might be an interesting sideline.
Give me time to think. Jerry.
Me? Oh, okay. How did I change? Uh, how did I change? I'm
You
not
can
sure.
even like which works mattered most to you and which works matter. That's one way to measure it. When you started, what was the premier Byron work when you started, and which ones are you drawn to now?
It's interesting because I realize with the Poetics of Adversity that I really haven't changed very much. It's true that the first Byron poem that I read that knocked me out was Don Juan. But that was before. That was when I was very much into poetry as such, and I read that poem, and I remember saying to myself, "Can you do that in poetry? Nobody does that." It just seemed to me a way of handling language that certain people in the 20th century learned to do, but you certainly didn't do that kind of thing in the 19th century. And that's where I was. And so it was a kind of revelation to me. But the always been, and I suppose my dissertation was on Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. And I've always been that poem. While I'm babbling on here, it occurs to me to say that the first two cantos of Childe Harold, when I read them, were appalling to me. And I thank my stars, as it were, that I was finally gifted be able to get into Childe Harold 3 and Childe Harold 4, which was where my heart was. But over time, Childe Harold 1 and 2 have become more and more important to me because I think they're among the most naked poems that he ever wrote. And I really like Byron naked.
Who doesn't? Bernard, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I suppose I began as a sort of slightly Byronic reader, sort of a Promethean Byron. I like Manfred, I like Childe Harold. I like the emphasis, I suppose, on will. I like the rhetoric. I actually like the first two cantos of Childe Harold, Partridge Jerry. And though I liked Don Juan, more than liked, I suppose I was mainly interested in finding more than what people said at that time. Currents going across from Childe Harold to Don Juan, which of course are there. Later, as I am now, but maybe it occurred a time ago, I've become much more interested in the transition generated indeed by the inherent energies of Byron's Prometheanism into something like its opposite, and that middle period of his time, 1816 to 18, where you can see something like a change occurring. And the change is basically, crudely speaking, from an extreme interest in will, which goes with an extreme interest in men, to an extreme interest in yielding, which goes with an extreme interest in women. And it's not only the women who are doing the yielding, as is the point of Don Juan. So that's a significant change in me.
We're getting close to the end of our time. We're not quite there yet, but I want to make sure that are there any other topics you two want to ask of one another, or topics you brought to the table? Bernard, a question for Jerry, maybe about his book, the unresolved issue.
Well,
Yeah.
go ahead, Bernard.
Oh, no, please.
No, please.
Oh, yeah. What intrigued me, in all kinds of ways, but a simple question, which is not easy for me to formulate. It's that when you write the book and you're explicit about it, you say in effect, this has been bottled up inside me for ages and ages and ages, and now I'm getting it out, or something like that. You know, I can now say this. Now I'm there, sort of thing. And if I've got it right, that you must mean that. It must be absolutely real. But I can't quite see what you're now saying that you haven't in a sense said before. That sounds like a disappointment. I don't mean it in the least like a disappointment, but I can't see, so to speak, the newness in it. Something is more articulately available to you now than it was. That's what I don't understand.
All right. I'm glad this has come up, actually, because what I haven't been able to wreak my thoughts upon expression about this yet has to do with what we call bad poetry. So that the last chapter of Byron and the Poetics of Adversity are trying to get at this issue. And it's a really difficult issue to get at because I'll come back to Childe Harold 1 and 2. Childe Harold 1 and 2 are full of what anybody will call very, very bad poetry. But there is a sense in which the poetry is so manifestly unguarded that the badness of the poetry ceases to be bad. It really becomes a kind of revelation because I used the word naked before, because it does seem to me to be poetry at an extreme verge of nakedness. And I don't think he himself, as it were, intended that, but it happens. And in the end, in the late poems, he knows how to manage that. But earlier, the reason that they're so moving is that he isn't able to manage it, but he's going to do it anyway. Now, I know I'm not expressing this very well, but it doesn't affect just Byron. It has to do with poetry in general, and what poetry that we think of as excellent and poetry that we don't think of as excellent. I often would say to my students when we're doing poetry that there's no such thing as a bad poem, in the sense that people want to say this is a bad poem, this is a good poem. All right, you can make that distinction. But as soon as a person decides that they're going to write poetry, they're taking on an obligation that is going to judge them. And it will appear in the work that you do. You might say that's a bad poem, but you've now been, your language has been judged by what you've decided to do.
I like that very much. It is indeed what you say in your last chapter, but you actually put it more clearly there than in that last chapter. I like it very much.
It takes us maybe to what our final topic, which might be what's next? What remains to be done in Byron studies? Jerry's, maybe you've already touched upon that going further with the idea of bad poetry and the poetic theory of that. But you know, as you finish these books, you look, we've got a lot of people in the audience who are interested in Byron, working on Byron. From your perspective, having done so much with Byron, where are we with Byron now? What work remains to be done? Or what does he have to offer us now, either as teachers or scholars or just readers, that you know, where are the rich seams of Byron studies that are still active?
Byron has to offer is Maria Schoine. And what Maria is doing, finally, it seems to me that she's going to be opening up the subject of Byron and Italian language and literature in a way that it needs to be done. This is the one great subject in Byron that has only barely been treated in the way it needs to be treated.
Byron Byron in Italy. This is Maria Schina in Thessaloniki. Yes, who's working. Yes, I agree 100%. Bernard, what do you say?
Well, you'll like the first part of what I'm going to say, and you won't like the second. The part that you like is that I agree entirely with the thing about Italy. It's not only that Diego Sarli, also the people. I mean, the relation with Italy is absolutely fundamental in Byron, and hasn't been given. It's lots of people have talked about it, but it's never been put in the centre in the way that it should be. That's the part that you like. The part that you won't like is I'm sniffy, I'm afraid. There I'm stuck with it. Sniffy by nature. I'm sniffy about the idea of progress in Byron studies. I'm sniffy about the idea there are still things to be done. It sounds too much like the sort of way people write, you know, justifying to get a grant out of someone. This is the new area. There I go back in a kind of corny language, and I'll defend the corny language. Byron is an entity. He's there. He's you don't get bored with him. Infinite is too strong a word, of course, but there is a kind of infinity in everyone, and there's an infinity certainly in great writers. So you don't actually necessarily want to find some new way or some unexplored avenue. You simply want to go back to something where if you can yourself get the right attitude, the riches just don't stop. And what people need to do is to have that sense of confidence in Byron, that you don't have to do anything to him, you just have to damn well listen to him, try to hear his voice, try to follow his processes of mind, which people have been doing since 1812, and we should carry on doing it. Boom.
That's the great thesis beginning of your book is we need to read Byron.
Yes.
It's pretty much that simple, and you do it
Yes.
so beautifully, both of you. Yes. Go ahead, Jerry.
I want to footnote that by saying that I'll say Paul West and Wilson Knight again. And the reason I want to say them again is that this, I agree with Bernard that the idea that we have to do something new is really quite it's full of illusions. Things have been done very, very well with Byron by people who wrote a long, long time ago. And it's their voice. It's not just Byron's voice. It's a voice of people who have been able to enter into the world that Byron has invited them into, and that they've been able to speak in the same kind of arresting way that we associate with Byron. And I would say certainly those two, but there are other people like Charles Dubois. That book meant an enormous amount to me when I read that book. Doris Langley Moore. These are people who have written about Byron, and they have a voice I'll never forget.
I feel the same way doing the biography, just reading Peter Quinnell, reading Iris Origo, reading Langley Moore. You're like, these people got it. Like what, so partly maybe what we're saying is re-immersing in the tradition of Byron readers, not just reading him on our own, but remembering that there are generations, indeed 2 centuries or more of Byron readers out there who have done a lot of interesting things that we're in danger of forgetting.
Yeah, I mean, you want Byron readers or readers of any kind of poetry, you want them to be reading that, not say reading the professional situation that you are in and earning or living with. There's an awful lot of work that's done, and that work looks like it's reading literature and poetry and so forth, but it's not. It's actually reading the profession, which is something else entirely.
Yes. Well, we're almost out of time. Any final words before I turn it back over to Emily? Thank you both so much for this conversation. I feel like we could sit around, and if we were all in the same room and had a bottle of wine in front of us, like Bernard does, we could probably sit and talk for a couple more hours, and I wish we could. But thanks to you both. This is, I hope, the beginning of more things like this, but I really appreciate it. And Emily, if you want to come back on and do any final words, please do.
Thank you. And I'd like to second what Annie was saying. Thank you both of you. That was absolutely outstanding. I've been inundated with messages on my phone. I keep going, this is so good. We're enjoying it so much. So I know both, and do take the time to look at the chat when you guys have stopped speaking. There's a lot of good, very, very positive comments in there. And so thank you again. I agree with Andy. It would have been nice if we were all in a pub somewhere or at a conference and could just carry on drinking and talking for the next 5 hours. That would have been wonderful. Sadly, however, the time is drawing to a close. And at least on my side, I know some of you are earlier in the morning, but for me, it is getting rather late at night on this side of the world. So once again, thank you, both of you and for Andy for moderating. And I think really covering, we've just covered so much. I wouldn't have thought we could have covered that many topics in a mere 55 minutes. So well done to all of you as well for giving a lot of answers in a very short space of time. Just before we finish up, Mark, if you could share the screen again, just a few notifications about some other events coming up that you might be interested in. On the UK Byron Society side, we have 3 events in person coming up. We have our annual Scotland lecture, which is going to be in Edinburgh in 2 weeks on Byron and Scottish folklore and Satan, and that's tying in with the Bars conference up there. So if you are in the area, do come and join us. Then we have a talk on Byron and Sterne in London, our August break, during which we'll talk about in a second. There is a brilliant conference that I hope you're all going to in America. Then we'll be back in London with a discussion of Byron's ridiculousness, and then a discussion online of Humphrey Davis's notebook. So even if you are not in the UK, certainly the final talk, the October talk, and indeed the November talks, you can attend online. Next slide, please. More importantly, probably more importantly than any other event other than today's one this year, we have this year's International Byron Society Conference. Now, as many of you know, we haven't been able to have an in-person annual event in a really very long time now. So this one will be particularly special, and it will be taking place in San Francisco. And it's been co-organized by Omar Miranda and Kayla Rose, who I believe are online. So if you have any questions for them, yes, Kayla's frantically adding messages in the chat now about that. You can also find other details about the event on the Byron Society website, on the Byron Society of America website, and on the International Association website, and the website for the conference itself. So we do many places where you can attend. And it looks like it's going to be a fabulous conference, and there's some really, really great papers and some really great additional activities happening. So I thoroughly recommend it if you can make it. Do we have any other slides? Oh yes, I forgot my conference. Last but not least, I'm delighted to be able to say that we will be able to continue the New Abbey Byron's conference going forwards. The Byron Society in London is taking over from the New Abbey Society, which is sadly closing its doors. And we are continuing the event in New Abbey itself, which I am really delighted about. So we have, with unusual advanced planning, managed to get the call for paper out quite early for next April. So I do hope you will consider a paper, or just to enjoy getting to talk about Byron and East and consider joining us next year. So I think that's everything from the slides.
Before you
Mark
go,
will let me know if I've forgotten anything. I think that's all.
I just want to thank you very, very much. I want to thank Mark, Andy. It's really very gracious of you to have done this, and it's a pleasure to finally see Bernard again. It's been so long since I've actually seen him, so it's lovely to see your face, Bernard. Thank you.
I'm really, really grateful. I was slightly apprehensive because you don't know what's going to happen in these things. But when it came, it was good. And thank you, Jerry.
Well, it's been fun. I've loved every minute of it. Thank you very much.
Thanks to you both, and thanks to all who made this happen, and to all of our attendees. Looking forward to seeing hopefully all of us will be together in person in 23 or 24. A lot of great events coming up. So thank you, Emily, for sharing that. And I know there's more next year with the big bicentennial as well. So thanks again, Jerry and Bernard.
On that note, if anyone is curious, we have created a central page on the Byron Society website, the UK Byron Society website, where we're consolidating all the events related to Byron for 2024 from across the world, regardless of whether, doesn't matter who's organizing them. So if you know of anything and wanted to include it, or just want to check up and see what's happening, please do visit that. It's on our website, just so that we can all try and attend as much as humanly possible, because there's just going to be a lot, and it's going to be great.
Thank you.
So, all right then, Mark, I think you're the
Thanks very much.
All right, adios.
Adios. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks again.
Shall I end the webinar, Emily?
Yes.
Okay.